Hello, how are you? First of all, I intend to be very, very brief. Second of all, I want to declare, which is probably not the right thing to do in this particular audience, is that I don't have any substantive issues with the particular forms of contract. I think there are an awful lot of other issues which make it difficult to say whether the forms of contract are effective or not effective. And I think basically it's a bit like getting into a car and driving along and having a crash. And immediately you blame the car. Right? It may be the car is the problem, but you also need to look at the driving, and you need to look at the distracting influences and all of the other things that are actually happening at the same time. So, there we are. So I'd like to go into one or two of those other issues. I'm reminded of the first speaker, Paul Morrell, and his particular quote on the Tower of Babel, and I'd like to rephrase it somewhat. Is the state decided to create a contract to give cost certainty, and fate was irritated at their impertinence and decided to create discord and ill feeling. And I think that's the situation we're in at the moment. There is an element of discord and ill feeling. There's a whole lot of stuff has happened over the last 5 to 7 years. None of it has been good. As has been said by the previous speaker, prices have tumbled an enormous amount as distinct from the perceived wisdom of the time, which was that prices would rise. People are hurting. There's a whole lot of stuff happening out there. And all of that makes it very, very difficult to identify what the particular ailment is, whether it is just one ailment. So I'm going to deal with a number of contracts issues. The first one is appropriate risk transfer, and I'm well aware that that's been mentioned by several of the speakers already. Second of all would be adequacy of tender information, and again that's a recurring theme. The procurement process comes in for an element as well, particularly the technical capacities of tendering firms and the means of identifying it, and again it's an issue Andrew has already referred to. Abnormally low tenders. That particular one is a very, very awkward one. I certainly would agree that it is not in the state's interest to accept an abnormally low tender, but it is actually quite difficult to define exactly what an abnormally low tender is, and particularly when you get into a severe disagreement between the relevant contractor and the state, and you have to make a balanced judgment between the risk of the project being completed. And I know there are issues about long-term supply chains, capacity of the industry in the future, but by and large, an individual contracting authority tends to be more concerned with getting their particular project on stream and completed. That's reality, that's human nature. Post-contract change orders. Yes, the original contract, the GCC suite of contracts, was designed to minimize change orders, and yes, it hasn't necessarily happened the way it should have. And last of all, I'd like to mention contractor performance, because I think this links to all of them. It's not just who was driving the car when it was crashed. It's the fact that we were all in the car together, and really we should actually be heading along in the same particular direction. There are some things that we on the state side should actually do and do better. There's some things that contractors need to do and do better. And again, we do actually need to build a little bit of a relationship going into the future, because times won't stay bad forever. First of all is appropriate risk transfer. The Department of Education and Skills has had in its guidance documents, I think since 2007, a note on risk assessment and risk transfer. And effectively what we have been advocating is that risk should be assessed first off, where possible it should be mitigated and quantified, and only then should one decide whether to transfer it or not. And the default position with us is that risk should not be transferred. In other words, whatever extra level of investigation is required to give that level of definition so that the documents can be created, so that the contractor will be aware of what they're getting themselves into. That is for the better of the state, because there is a greater level of certainty, because the contractor as well as the client knows what they're doing. Risk should not be transferred where it cannot be reasonably evaluated. It's not an easy way for a contracting authority to get out of doing a job of work and say, we'll dump it on the contractor. Okay, so far I'm probably not annoying you too much, but don't worry, I'll get round to it. Okay, next one is the adequacy of the tender information. And it's quite obvious, I'm trying to butter you up at this particular stage, is all information reasonably needed to price and construct the project. Yes, we've heard words such as the contract must be fully designed. I mean, that was in the advertising blur back in 2004 when the original GCC contracts were being promulgated. In actual fact, fully designed does not appear in the form of contract at all. What is required is an adequate level of information that the contractor can price. And if change orders are required post-tender, once a contract has been awarded, a correct and fair process for making sure there is an appropriate adjustment in price. So we do need well-defined, well-detailed set of tender documents. There is no such thing as an absolute full design. I mean, it is an impossibility. I think the other thing that needs mentioning as well is that in all of this presupposes the competency of the contractor and the contractor's personnel. It doesn't matter what form of contract one actually uses, whether it's the GDLA, the GCC, or another form of contract. In all situations, the contractor is deemed to be an intelligent, competent person. The foreman is deemed to be able to read drawings, to understand information, and ask appropriate and sensible questions. It goes back to Clause 4.1 of the contract, as Steve Rousel already indicated, is the contract should be conducted with the intention of full cooperation, reciprocal cooperation. That does at the moment appear to be lacking, or at least intermittent. Okay, sorry, I'm going to put on my glasses because I can't always see what I'm doing. The next one is procurement process, Circular 1010. Circular 1010, for those of you who aren't familiar with it, are basically saying, give small to medium enterprises a chance. And yes, that makes a degree of sense. It is important that small to medium enterprises get a fair crack at the whip, but it is also important that there be a balance, that an appropriate size contractor is capable of doing an appropriate size job of work. We have implemented that pretty much from the day it came in. We have a guidance document, DTP 2012 Procurement and Contractors, available on the web for anybody who wants to look at it. We do use the open procedure, but we do have some difficulty in convincing some of our consultants of the appropriateness of using the open procedure. They say, and I don't know whether there's a justification or not, that, well, it's very difficult to get the right contractor if you use the open procedure. The reply to that, at least in my view, is if the pre-qualification standards or the suitability assessment standards are set at the right level, neither too high nor too low, then you will by definition have the right contractors doing the work. That may not be your pet contractors, but that's beside the point. Okay, use of declarations, that's already been raised. We fervently believe in declarations. We see absolutely no reasons why contractors should come in with wads of paper on every single individual contract. If something is capable of being done by declaration and being verified later on, yep, we're for it. Anything that simplifies the system, we're in favour of. And lastly, I'd like to go into the whole business of contractors' personnel and previous experience of the firm. It is a grey area, contractors' personnel, because the person put forward for the project isn't always the person that turns up on the doorstep to start doing the job. So I think we need to be clear as to what we're asking for. We shouldn't be asking for something unreasonable, but on the other side of the story, if we do ask for something, we should actually enforce it. And lastly, the previous experience of the firm. I know I'm being very procedural in everything that I'm actually talking about here, but I am actually trying to get at a particular point. So next item I want to mention is contractor performance. I've criticised to a degree how we do our work. We can do it better. I would hope that we will do it better. But I also think I need to say that from the point of view of contractors is we need to get to a situation where contractors who give a good performance, who do the work in that spirit of cooperation, will be advantaged in future tender processes, whereas contractors who fail to do the work in the manner that they should, in accordance with the contract, should be disadvantaged. And that's really where I'm heading. So effectively speaking, what I'm trying to do is say the Directive 2004-18 says the suitability of economic operators shall be checked by contracting authorities. The technical and or professional abilities shall be assessed and examined. So effectively speaking, if we're talking about the previous experience of the firm, we have two elements that we are actually looking at. The list of works carried out and certificates of satisfactory execution. Now, by and large, contracting authorities receives the information in and awards marks based on what's actually put in. Not necessarily there's a detailed marking system, though sometimes there actually is. But there is a whole wealth of information that either is available or can be made available, which will actually give us a better scope of determining whether a contractor has actually performed adequately on previous work. And I would say that from my perspective, the European Union directives are not just saying we can, but probably saying that we should actually be looking at this information. Because look at it from the point of view of a good contractor who's doing their job, is if they're losing out on a tender opportunity because somebody else has been lying through their teeth, that ain't fair either. So there needs to be a balance somewhere along the line where there is a level of checking of the information that actually comes in, and the information requested is focused to allow that checking to be objective. So, effectively speaking, the certificates specify whether they were carried out according to the rules of the trade and properly completed, i.e., were they completed in accordance with the contract. Now, I've thrown up a couple of thoughts here, which are basically elements that one can actually say they were properly completed in accordance with the contract, and elements which I might mention in passing, which probably one can't. So effectively speaking is, if I'm a contracting authority or an employee's representative, and I have a blinding row with my contractor, and we're in dispute from word go, there's claims for this, there's claims for that, I'm huffing and puffing and saying, well, this contractor is awful. But part of me, the guilty part at the back of my mind, is saying, well, actually, maybe I could have done a better job way back when I was preparing the tender documents. Maybe I could have been more proactive during the actual contract administration period. So really what I want to do is move away completely from that subjective view of how you measure contractual performance, because it ain't fair. We need to go for those things which are actually measured by the contract. For example, date for substantial completion. And yes, there are 101 reasons why that date will be adjusted. There's a mechanism in the contract for adjusting it. But if at the end of the day the contract hasn't been completed and is 6 months behind the adjusted date for substantial completion, something has failed in regards to that contract, and it is a recordable thing that can and should be used for measuring contractor performance. Standard of construction is another one. Work executed in a proper and workmanlike manner, work items of good quality. Again, there are mechanisms in the contract for recording, for example, where defects are allowed and there's a deduction in money to allow for the fact that they weren't up to the original standard. If that occurs, then you can actually say there is something objective and measurable here. Compliance with contract conditions. Compliance with instructions, compliance with paying conditions clauses, defects remedied within a reasonable time. All of these are things which are measurable. If something has gone wrong, they should be recorded somewhere in the contract administration documents. Generally speaking, it'll be the site minutes, or unless it's to and from the contractor and the employer's representative. For example, paying conditions clause is there are 1 or 2 contractors, thankfully not very many, who wouldn't necessarily be up to full speed in terms of compliance. It is not in the interest of the contracting authority or any of those other contractors who do comply for this failure to be allowed to go unchecked. So from my perspective, I would like to see, if there is a recorded failure, that it should have an implication in terms of future contracts, a capacity of a contractor to get on future lists. Documents and records maintained. Yes, there have been a fair degree of, I suppose, disputes of one kind or another, although thankfully, certainly on our side, not too many have progressed too far. But one of the best ways of preventing disputes is to actually have a good set of records maintained. And consequently, is I would like to see a scenario where the employee's representative does actually ask for these records. They are provided for in the contract, and where the contractor does actually provide them. Not least a log of all instructions and the status of each and every instruction. Not least a log of claims. And again, I'm not saying the claims aren't valid, but a log of where a claim was made, what its status, when it's been actually looked at. Because a lot of the issues that come up in terms of dispute resolution is because of a disagreement between the contractor and the employee's representative as to what actually happened in the contract. If there is a record and a continuous record kept, it makes it far less likely for there to be a dispute. Now, I think really what I'm trying to say is, yes, the contract has certainly teething troubles, maybe there's some faults as well, but there are a whole range of issues has made it very, very difficult for us to say whether the contract works well or doesn't work well. My personal view is that it's no better nor worse than any other form of contract. It's how it's applied on both sides that matters. And in terms of a spirit of cooperation, I would like to see contracting authorities devoting more time and attention to making sure that their contract preparation is correct, so that change orders afterwards are minimised, so the contractor isn't taking on risks that they don't need to. And on the other side, I would like to see contractors actually proceeding diligently with the work and getting it done quickly, getting it done well, and using that record of their good performance to provide or to allow for a greater capacity to get work in the future. Thank you.